Hi, I'd like to give you a gentle introduction to functional programming by doing a scenario that has surely come across just about any JavaScript developer's desk at some point in time, and that is to take an array of objects and create from it an array containing of only one of these fields. So, for example, the x coordinates of these points. Note that I'm using the CoffeePad utility so that you can see code in both CoffeeScript and JavaScript. So a typical way of doing this, it has three parts. If we want to console log the result of plucking the x coordinate from every object, we'll create an empty array, fields, and then we'll do a loop. Now this is the compiled code that CoffeeScript generates. You might write a slightly cleaner loop, but you'll still be writing a loop to push into the fields array o.x and then console log fields. So that is one way of doing it, but I said this would be a gentle introduction to functional programming. So for the purpose of this discussion, let's take functional programming to mean not using loops and see how we can do that. So turns out that one of the ways you can start developing functional programming in JavaScript is to use the underscore library. This lives on the web at _js.org, and it gives you methods off of the underscore character to run a function on each member of an array, and it has a whole bunch of functionality, each and map being the two most important. And it turns out you could have written that loop using underscore each, but it turns out that underscore JS has a more specific method called pluck, which just lets you say from the objects array, pluck the x coordinate off of each one. So JavaScript or CoffeeScript, it's underscore.pluck, and it works. So that's pretty neat. I highly encourage you to check out the underscore library. But let's continue. Let's see how we can make this a little bit more functional, because in this case we didn't actually write a function, we used a function. So let's look at another variant of this using the map function. So according to underscore's documentation, map produces a new array of values by mapping each value in list through a transformation function. Okay, so this corresponds to 1, 2, 3 all being passed through this function that multiplies by 3, and you have 3, 6, 9. So we could actually use this idea of map and say the following: objects.map a function that accepts an O, or object if we want to name it that way, and returns o.x. So let's look at the JavaScript form of that. It pretty much reads the same. Function takes an O, returns an o.x. We apply that using the map function, and we get the same result. So map is very useful. Don't think of it as a map like a spatial map. Think of it as a correspondence. And we're establishing a correspondence from each object in the source to each field that's been selected in the destination. And it's up to you in JavaScript whether you want to write this as a one-liner or not, but one of the reasons I use CoffeeScript is that it doesn't strike me as funny to make this a one-liner. Now, there's another syntax that I think would be kind of cool. What if we said console.log objects.map pluck x, where pluck is not coming from the underscore library, but is a function of our own design. Now, notice that in the JavaScript land, parentheses are placed in such a way so that you can see that first pluck x is being called, then that is being passed to objects.map, and then that is being placed to console.log. You may want to do the same thing in CoffeeScript as far as putting parentheses in, but that's a matter of style. I won't make a comment on that right now. Just want to see what will it take so that when we run this, we don't get something that says, pluck doesn't work. So if you think about this for a second, map accepts a function, so pluck x needs to return a function. So let's get us set up in the simplest way possible. Pluck is a function which returns a function that plucks the x field off of whatever is given to it. And so it turns out that with either of these syntaxes, you see for the CoffeeScript, because the words function and return are like over half of the body of this. With this behavior, we actually get something that plucks the x field off of every object. But I didn't write this so we could always get x. I wrote this so that we could pass a y to it sometimes and get a y. And you can see that our current implementation is always selecting x. So even though this may be new to you, think for a second. How could we modify this pluck function returning function in order to take this parameter? Here's how I think you would do it. Pluck has to take a field name. And here you've now declared pluck to take a field name, but it still returns the same function that it did before. Can you reference o.field? Not exactly. Field is going to be dynamic. It's going to be the string y, and you can't exactly do that. So what do we need to do? Well, every object can be referenced as o.x or o.x. So that means that we can actually reference this as o and then field. If we run this now you see we are selecting the y value and we are selecting the x value and switching those out at whim. And this was made possible by returning a function that is different for each one of these. Now, you may or may not want to write functions this way, but when you see a pattern like plucking going on, as you would see in the D3 library quite frequently, it starts to make sense to want to return functions that do that. Because I think it reads a little bit nicer, never mind the console log, but objects.map pluck x. That reads nice to me. It's definitely subjective, but if you get one thing from this cast, understand that the looping that you've been doing can probably be done in different ways. It's always the case in programming. That the underscore library contains some very nice utilities and is a very good way to get started with functional programming. And eventually you can move into writing your own functions and then writing your own functions that return functions. If that doesn't blow your mind, I don't know. I find it very enjoyable. So I hope you found this interesting. Email me with any questions, and thanks for watching.